So thank you, Federico, for that very generous introduction. I'm always a little bit embarrassed when I listen to introductions, very positive introductions of myself. I'm reminded of what Lyndon Johnson said once when he received a prize after he retired as president, and he said that, thank you for that introduction. He said, I wish my parents had been here to listen to it. My father would have been very proud, and my mother would actually have believed it. Now, I do think that in this particular introduction, Federico was not just most generous to me and the work that I've done, but he also gave a real and a very good overview of my intellectual trajectory. And he hit right on that. In terms of why I got into this in the first place, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about tomorrow here, how my interests were shaped, and how the frameworks have worked for me in terms of bringing things together. So I'm a lumper, not a splitter. I like to bring things together. I like to see how they work when different intellectual traditions, different historiographical traditions, different disciplines come together and try to enlighten us about whatever subject that we are working on. And of course, being here at EUI is a really good place to reaffirm my commitment to those ideals, because it's very much in the lifeblood of this institution. So I want to thank Richard and Francesca, Valeria, Victor, others who've set this up, Corinna, in addition to Federico, for bringing me here today. And it's a real pleasure and honor to be able to speak to you tonight. So what I'm going to try to do for about 40 minutes or so is to look at the project that Federico has already outlined in terms of how it led me to set up the text that was published this year. So this is not a book talk. I'm not going to talk about the book. I'm going to do more about that tomorrow. But I'm going to talk a bit about what led me in the direction of conceptualizing the Cold War the way I did. And that was hard work. That was difficult, because I had decided, after much hesitation, to do one more book, one attempt at trying to summarize some of the preoccupations that I've had really for the past 25 years, and figure out how we can see this today in terms of positioning the Cold War within 20th century history. So what sometimes happens when you start a project is that you discover that you've been there before, right? I'm sure that's happened to a number of you as well. You start looking at something and then you realize, well, I have thought about this before, but maybe not exactly in the same manner as I have on this occasion. So what is the key aspect of leading me in the direction that this particular project took is my preoccupation with the Cold War as an ideological conflict. So as a global clash between the theory and practices of capitalism on the one hand and socialism on the other. And I then started thinking, very much influenced actually by work that has been done here in Italy by Federico and others. I'm always, when I am in Italy, reminded of how many brilliant historians of that era who have worked in this country or still working in this country. I wanted to look at the time extension of that conflict. I wanted to look at the conflict between socialism and capitalism in terms of a chronology. So some of my students who remained wonderfully skeptical to this project throughout, that's one of the best things that could ever happen to you, have students tell you, nah, you're not sure you want to do this, you may want to sort of move in that direction. And particularly reminding me that, well, haven't you done this before? So I did a book called The Global Cold War, as Professor Romero mentioned. What would be different in this project from what I did 10 years ago? Well, what is different is first and foremost the time frame. And I think my students got this right, not entirely, but they got it mostly right, when they would be saying what I did in the global Cold War was to expand our understanding of, or attempt to expand our understanding of the Cold War conflict on a geographical scale. In this project, I tried to expand it on a chronological scale. So this is a project I figured out quite early in my work with it, that had to go back to the 19th century in order to understand why so many people in so many different parts of the world took this particular ideological split as seriously as they did for a very long period of time. So this project starts in the 1890s with the first global capitalist crisis and the radicalization of very significant parts of the European labor movement and the expansion of Russia and the United States as transcontinental empires. And it ends in the 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Soviet experiment. So then the challenge is, if you believe that it's necessary, in order to understand the Cold War fully, to go back to the 19th century, how do you then actually position it and delimit it? Because then the danger is, and this is something that has happened very often within the field of Cold War history in a general sense, that you subsume everything else that have happened under a kind of Cold War heading. And that was what I was desperately preoccupied with not doing. I wanted to position it in a pretty crowded century of other things that had been going on. You know, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, decolonization, European integration, the rise of China, East Asia in economic terms. I wanted to position the Cold War within that larger framework, but without attempting to subsume everything else under it. I wanted to speak about the effects that the Cold War had on these other developments, recognizing and generalizing from their autonomous development, an autonomous, most autarkic origins in some cases, but also to talk about the effects that these developments had on the Cold War. And the latter point is particularly important for this project, because we've had a tendency in the overall historiography, and particularly US historiography, of essentializing the Cold War. It has really become about 2 states, the United States and the Soviet Union, and then the effects that this is supposed to have had elsewhere in the world. That's a scheme that I do not recognize. I didn't quite recognize it before, now I've given up on it entirely. I want to look at the effects that these other things that went on had on the Cold War, how they shape it, and maybe first and foremost how they dramatized it, how they made it so much more intense than many people would have thought that the conflict would be, looked from the period before the First World War. Now, historians, as you will know, are preoccupied with periodization. You're not a historian if you are not preoccupied with trying to figure out how things fit together in neat blocks. So I sometimes tell my social science friends that, you know, you have to bear over with us on that. We cannot be otherwise. The point, of course, is that you should never be taken hostage by your periodization. You want to get it to work for you, not the other way around. So for this project overall, I saw broadly speaking, 4 time periods that connect, of course, in many important ways, but also have an internal coherence in terms of interpretation, which was part of what gave meaning to the project for me. So the first period goes from the 1890s and up to 1917 or thereabouts, the era of the Russian Revolution and the US intervention in the First World War. The second period from 1917 to 1941, again, the year in which both the United States and the Soviet Union get involved in another global war. Then the third period, and this is perhaps one of the things that have been discussed quite a bit as I presented on this project in the early phase, runs from 1941 and up to the early 1970s. So I very clearly, blatantly do not emphasize a late 1940s set of events that leads to what we see as the interstate Cold War. More about that later. I see a continuity coming out of the US and Soviet involvement in the Second World War, which then lasts up to the early 1970s. And to the early 1970s for the very good reason that that's when the global capitalist economic system starts to change again, right? With the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and the beginning global expansion of financial capital, what some people call globalization, or the second globalization. And then fourthly, from the early 1970s up to 1991, or the early 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So note here, and I'll get back to this right at the end of my talk, but I think of the Cold War as the past. I think there are enormously important aspects of the Cold War that have shaped the world that we live in today, but as a central conflict, as a central organizing principle of people's existence in this country or in Eastern Europe or in Africa or Southeast Asia, it is no longer there, right? So some people talk about as, you know, a new Cold War between the United States and Russia today, or that relations between the United States and China could develop into a new Cold War. I don't see that, because in all of these settings, there will be a lot of conflict without any doubt, but it won't be a Cold War because there is very little of that ideological element in it. Russia and China today are perfectly well living within a set of capitalist practices that they have taken over from the West, while the Soviet Union and European communism in the 20th century never was. I was also, in starting this project, preoccupied with comparisons, and this very much comes out of my LSE background. So the LSE is a wonderful laboratory for interdisciplinarity, a bit like the EUI is as well. So I started thinking about, you know, how do this particular ideological conflict, Cold War, compare to other Cold Wars, other Cold Wars, other ideological conflicts that created international systems. What I found on that is that there are some, but there are not many. It's quite a rare condition in terms of human affairs. Most international systems are unipolar. Think China's role in East Asia over a very long period of time. Or they are multipolar. Think about most of European history, you know, certainly going back to the late first millennium. So bipolarity is not very common. There are some. I mean, you could talk about, I guess, the rivalry between Rome and the Persian Empire in the first 3 centuries AD. You could think about, which I write a bit about in the book, the Song-Liao rivalry in China, 2 states that clashed ideologically in the 11th, early 12th century on a base that is not entirely different from what the Cold War was, a competition for modernity to some extent and control of that. You could of course talk, as many people have done, about England and Spain, mid-16th to early 17th century. But it's rare. I mean, it doesn't happen often. And in the contemporary era, I think the Cold War, in the form that I've spoken about it here, is probably the only one that's been around. So one of the challenges that I worked on quite a bit was trying to figure out how the ideological conflict that came out of the 19th century developed into a state system after the Second World War. Now, some of this is obvious. It's not really very difficult, right? If you look at military aspects of how the Second World War was fought, and sometimes, and this is an argument I made in an earlier book, it's really important to look at military history. So people who work on international history, particularly transnational history of sort of a cultural and intellectual bent, do not often take military affairs as seriously as they ought to be taken. So clearly, the transformation of this into an international system had a lot to do with how that Great War, the Second World War, ended, with two great powers being the last ones standing. All the other projects that opposed, in various forms, the ideological divide that existed had been defeated. Fascism, National Socialism, Japanese militarism, but also various forms of Western imperialism, British and French imperialism, the Japanese imperialism, from the early part of the 20th century that wanted to position themselves very deliberately as an alternative both to the socialist challenge, but also to the kind of capitalist practices that came out of the United States. They had lost. Now, where this really becomes interesting, of course, is not so much that you can see on the ground. What is interesting, and this is, of course, what Paul Kennedy and others have written so insightfully about, is how that happened, right? And this is where I think starting this project in the 1890s makes perfect sense. It's one of the many reasons why it's important to start it there. Because what happens then is the creation of the United States and Russia as a kind of mega empires, as a kind of states, societies, that simply have much more power potentiality at their disposal because of their transcontinental expansion, the contiguous land empires that they actually become, than any of the other challenges could possibly have. So if this sounds like a sort of hyper-realist argument in a way, there is an element of that in there. I mean, some people would also call it a materialist argument. You know, in the sense that the 1945 divide, in that perspective, does remind one of Karl Marx's famous saying. Marx said a lot of things that were correct, but he was never more correct when he said that people make their own history, but not under circumstances of their own choosing. Very true in 1945. There was a trajectory coming out of the 1890s that privileged these two states, the United States and what had then become a Soviet Union, over others because of the resources that they had access to. And that is also very important, I think, to understand in realizing how this particular ideological conflict became, for almost 2 generations, an international system that everyone had to relate to in one form or another. Now, out of that comes something that became, and a number of the reviews for the book have picked this up, which I'm happy to see, one of the key aspects of the project I was engaged in. And that was about re-establishing the autonomy and the significance of the Soviet Union in terms of international history in the 20th century. And I did that very much based on a reaction against post-Cold War historiography, particularly in the United States, but unfortunately also quite prevalent in Europe, increasingly, that seemed to center the Cold War as an international system almost relentlessly on the United States. Now, some of you would think that what I have in mind here are what I refer to in the book as the triumphalist approaches to the US victory in the Cold War. So, John Gaddis is often mentioned. John is a fantastic historian, but I think he's wrong in terms of how he sees the ending of the Cold War. And others who are working in that way. I also see some of the critics on the left making a similar, not identical, but similar historiographical error by looking at how the Cold War ended and simply declaring, well, it was about the United States all along. Under Stevenson's point about the United States being a Cold War, right? From its very beginning, the United States was created to wage relentless ideological war against everyone who thought otherwise. I'm very critical of both those approaches, because I think it removes agency from what is outside of the United States. But even worse, it makes it so much harder to understand how many of the conflicts of the Cold War came to mean so much for people in different parts of the world that were not related to what was going on politically in the United States. I think that's incredibly significant. So this is not about writing the United States out of the Cold War, but it is about attempting to look at it as an interactive system. And in order to do that, particularly in terms of people's experiences and backgrounds, it is very important to think about agency on the Soviet side that goes beyond simply being a foil, backdrop for whatever the United States decided to do in the world. The United States had its own agency, so did the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union operated for almost all of its existence according to a very clearly defined non-capitalist logic. The Soviet Union didn't exist because it was part of the periphery that had been excluded from capitalist practices in the West, where the idea under that being the poor Russians really wanted to participate in global capitalism, but they were not allowed to do so. I think that's a profound misunderstanding of the legacy of the Russian Revolution in Russia and elsewhere. The Soviet Union placed itself deliberately outside of that particular form of capitalist development that broke through in the 20th century. Not that it didn't want to trade or it wanted to interact, but in terms of how it organized its own affairs, how it functioned, how it worked as a state and a society. Now, if you want to try to get to grips with a project of this sort, one of the biggest challenges that you have, and this is not just for me, I think it's anyone who works on these kinds of matters on a global scale, how you integrate the various geographical parts of the world with the chronology that you have drawn up. And to me, this was a real challenge, because even though we now have, as Professor Romero referred to, a very exciting historical and historiographical literature on capitalist and socialist practices, or the clashes between them, or the Cold War, whatever you define it, it's very uneven in terms of the areas that it covers. So this very quickly became my main preoccupation within this project, to try to think about how matters changed in different parts of the world. So what was the Cold War trajectories in different parts of the world, particularly areas that I myself had not worked much on before. So I spent much more time working on Latin America. I spent much more time working on India. And parts of what I did on India was a real eye-opener to me, more about that in just a second. I spent much more time working on the interrelationship between decolonization and Cold War, in a very sort of practical form than what I'd done before. We can discuss more about this in the Q&A afterwards, but let me just talk a little bit about India. So, very often, the way the Cold War is presented in its latter stages, particularly again from a US perspective, is that it's a bipolarity, United States and the Soviet Union, that develops into, at least in diplomatic terms, a kind of triangular diplomacy, with China being the third center. I don't see it that way. During almost all of the Cold War period that we're looking at, China was either allied with the Soviet Union or entirely on the side of what was happening internationally by its own choice during the Cultural Revolution and up to the 1980s. It's India that in many ways is the Cold War wildcard. The only major power that very deliberately wants to constitute itself as a kind of anti-Cold War, coming out of its colonial experiences, and particularly the anti-colonial ideas of the Indian National Congress. So India is a fantastic example of how difficult that was to do, right? It was really hard in terms of international affairs. Think about how India was put under tremendous pressure on several occasions in its relationship to the United States, in its relationship to China and the Soviet Union. But even more, it was difficult in terms of modernization, in terms of development models from within. And this is where I really had, when I went to the Indian archives and started working there, real eye-openers. So what the leadership of the Congress Party tried to do in the 1950s was to create a non-aligned India that was increasingly moving in the direction of a planned economy. And that planned economy was not just something that came out, as I've written elsewhere, of a lot of Indian leaders being trained at LSE and studying with Harold Lasky and those kinds of things. It was much more closely patterned on the Soviet experiment than what we have seen before. If you go to the documents of the Indian Planning Commission, the Central Planning Commission, you will see how much the idea come up from very early on of trying to pattern India's development on what was seen as hyper-modernity, the kind of modernity that would take over gradually, which would be planning and would be an orientation towards setting up, at least domestically, a system that was state-based rather than private capital and interaction-based. That, I think, is one of the most important issues to look at, not just for India, but also in terms of how other countries, in terms of their own development struggles, thought about the ideological part of the Cold War, the ideological aspects of the Cold War. India failed in doing this, I think it would be right to say. But it failed for reasons that had a lot to do with how difficult it was to take that position in a situation in which there was relentless pressure to conform to concepts of Cold War bipolarity. And sometimes it's very important to study failures. Very often, particularly in Cold War history, we spend too much time looking at successes. And therefore, we do not understand the broader perspective of what is actually going on. Parts not taken are sometimes really, really important to study in order to understand what is happening. So let me finish by talking a little bit about how the Cold War ended. Because the framework, it seems to me, that is presented to us most often is that the Cold War came to an end because one political and economic system seems to work much better than the other economic and political system. And of course, the reality is much more complex than that. The reality is that the Cold War ended both as an ideological conflict and as an international system in different ways in different places. Over a very long period of time, stretching back to the 1970s. For China, in many ways, the ideologically based conflict came to an end with the counter-revolutionary coup in 1976, when the Maoists were excluded from power, and the kind of new state that Deng Xiaoping wanted to build, which always was much more preoccupied with market-based forms of development than with socialist forms of development, even though it kept elements of both. In the Middle East, you could argue that the Cold War, at least in its original form, came to an end with the Iranian Revolution, so in the late 1970s. To the surprise of most people involved, certainly on the US and Soviet side, and the documents on this are quite fascinating, when someone, in this case, the Ayatollah Khomeini, stands up and saying, neither East nor West, but God, that there is a revolutionary principle that is more significant than anything that can be presented by the left, which was his particular target, but also by US capitalist practices. And that is to be found in the Holy Quran. So the Cold War in that sense was outcompeted by other alternatives in different parts of the world at different times. And very often, as we saw, this gave rise to ideological alternatives that tended towards what I would call identitarianists. So identitarianism, the concepts of other forms of identity over collectivist forms of identity, was a very significant reason why the Cold War ended the way it did. China's defection from planning socialism in the 1980s was a very important reason why the Soviet Union became isolated the way it was in terms of international affairs and in economic terms. And of course there was the lack of reform inside the Soviet Union and inside Eastern Europe itself as well, in addition to the political oppression that took place in those countries. Didn't just give socialism a bad name internationally, but it also held back the kind of development that could have happened, I would argue, around planned or socialist alternatives when that was sacrificed in reform terms on behalf of keeping political control by the communist parties. And then, of course, there was what happened on the Western side, which is probably more significant than anything else, and that's what I referred to already. That is the massive expansion of capitalist practices through finance capital on a global scale. Now, to me, this is the most significant part of understanding why the Cold War ended the way it did as an international system. And you see this throughout the 1980s, probably going back to the late 1970s. And it's not just about neoliberal ideology. It is about practices that are spreading on the ground. The idea that it's not just any form of capitalism that would be seen as better than planning practices. It's a very particular American form of capitalism. And this starts well before the Soviet Union is getting into serious trouble in the mid-1980s. If you look at countries like Vietnam or Mozambique, or almost across the socialist world, not least in Eastern Europe itself, it's clear that the breakthrough for the kinds of thinking that privileges a particularly strict market-based concept of economic exchange is privileged well before the Soviet Union itself, with Gorbachev, starts throwing in the towel, saying, you know, we too are going to change. Now, this is an important corrective, I think, to the story, which is still the predominant story in the United States, that the United States won the Cold War through the remilitarization, as if there ever was a re in militarization on the US side, during the 1980s, which is almost certainly untrue, right? The reason why the Soviet Union spent far too much on military expenditure was not rearmament in the 1980s. It was that the Soviet Union had already been doing that for a very, very long time, right? The Soviet Union could never really afford its military budget. So understanding the collapse of the Cold War system, I think, is particularly meaningful, and I'll end with this, Federico, in terms of going back and understanding the whole trajectory coming out from the late 19th century. It is an end point in terms of the ideological challenges that had arisen almost 4 to 5 generations before. Now, the reason, I think, why this particular ideological divide had become as intense as it did, intense in the sense that otherwise sane people were willing to sacrifice a significant number of humankind for their beliefs through nuclear warfare, can only be understood in that context, that the stakes were extremely high because it was about the future of the world, I mean, how the world was going to work. And you don't get that intensity if you do not understand that if you were born around 1890, almost anywhere in the world, your childhood and youth was not going to be a very happy one because of what happened, because of the First World War, decolonization, the global economic crisis. So there is a starting point to this intensity of conflict that needs to be understood. Why the stakes were so high. Also, by the way, in a generational sense. Think about, so who developed the nuclear programs of the Cold War? Well, they were exactly people who were born around 1890, right? They had had this experience, they'd gone through all of this. But also that it comes to an end point in terms of the end of Cold War logic, if you put it that way. Where other alternatives are starting to be more significant than what went into the Cold War towards the end of the 20th century. So this is what I hope that this project does, that it refashions some of our thinking about how to conceptualize the Cold War in its various incarnations within a 20th century setting, without trying to privilege it over other things that are happening, but still give us more of an understanding of the kind of real world that now very soon, not just the parental generation, but the grandparental generation actually lived in. Thank you very much.